Good evening. There we go. I hate to break up good fellowship, but it's time for us to begin. If you'll be opening up your Bibles to Luke chapter 16, Mark chapter 16. We were just talking about Sunday morning class and got me on the wrong gospel. Mark chapter 16 is where we are at this evening, and we'll probably, hopefully, finish through the chapter this evening because next Wednesday night begins our Wednesday night summer series, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end of our class time together. But I wish I'd have written down when we started Mark. It was before last year's summer series, so it's been a while that we've been on Mark, but I hope that it's been a good study for you and encouraged you as we've gone through it. As we think about the denying self and following Jesus, that has really been the theme. Who's going to be king of your life? And we've looked at the last couple of weeks the ultimate example of denying self and letting the Lord reign is Jesus himself, in the fact that he didn't want to go to the cross. He didn't want to be crucified and go through the pain and problems that he went through. But nevertheless, he was willing to do so. And as we ended up last week in chapter 15, we ended up with, after his death, his being buried. And we talked a little bit about how that there was a group of ladies that paid attention to where he was buried because everything would have been done very hurriedly there on that Friday afternoon, as they had to be done before the Sabbath would have begun on Friday evening at 6 p.m. No more work could have been done from that point on. And that leads us into chapter 16 and seeing what, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. We missed about 3 Wednesday nights in a row back earlier in the winter, and it put my schedule behind, and I've been working so hard to try to get us caught back up because I didn't want to get Jesus in the tomb and then say, and now in 3 months we'll find out what happened next, So anyway, hopefully we can see some good news tonight. So we've talked about the crucifixion and death. We've talked about Jesus being buried. And then tonight we're going to talk about the resurrection. And Matt Valley and his crew were out mowing our yard today, and he was asking me about class tonight, and I said, we're talking about the resurrection tonight. If that don't get you fired up, I don't know what would, There's a movie on Amazon Prime that we watched last night, I guess it was, called Church People. And it's about this youth minister that's working with this preacher who's gone off the deep end, and he's made everything a spectacle, and he's talking about how that we got to come up with something really big this year for Easter services, something that'll really get everybody's attention. And the youth minister goes, you mean bigger than the resurrection? And this is the biggest big that could be. And that's why it's so important for us. Before we get into the text, though, I want to show you some pictures. I mentioned last week that I had some, and I couldn't readily pull them up. But this is in an ancient, when we made our trip over to Israel, an ancient burial tomb that was cut into the side of a mountain of a very important rabbi, and probably would be at least somewhat similar to the tomb in which Jesus would have been buried. You notice that as you're going down these the caves, there's these little side caves, and you can see how over on the left of that particular one, there's a place to bury the body. They would basically, it was kind of like pine tar is the closest thing I can describe it. They would take and mix up all sorts of sweet-smelling spices and that type of thing, and basically coat the body with that, and it would harden, make a shell around the body as they decomposed. And then after a year, they would go back in, take all that off, and take the bones and put it in a smaller box and put it in a smaller encasement for that. This is I told you there's 2 different places that they think maybe was the hill of Calvary and the garden tomb nearby. This is the one, this is a picture from back in the 50s of it, because if you can kind of see in the kind of in the middle to the left, there's those two dark spots that are little caves. It kind of looks like a skull there. And, of course, that's what Calvary meant, was the place of the skull. So they're thinking that this is right outside the city of Jerusalem. And off to the left of the picture, there's a little garden, and there's a tomb that they found that dates back to the 1st century. And this one feels like what you would imagine as you're reading the text. There's another one that is probably historically matches up. This is that same hill today, and you can see how over the course of time that it's kind of messed up the face-looking spot of it, and they put a bus parking lot down below it for the tourism and all of that. But maybe this is the hill, maybe not. This is the other place that is considered possibly the place that Jesus was crucified, but on and around this entire area has been this giant cathedral built, and there are, I think it's 7 different churches that have offices, and they burn incense and do all these sorts of things. It's kind of a weird feeling in there the whole time that you're in there. It feels like you're in a place, when you leave, you almost feel like you should say, "I'm sorry, I went there, Father." I just, because it feels like you've gone to a bad place because there's so much weird kind of things going on. And maybe the weirdest of all is all 7 of these quote-unquote Christian religions that are involved in this place, none of them trust each other, so they hired a Jewish man to hold the keys for the building, and he goes down and opens it up every day and then locks it up every night. Which you can imagine how great an influence that they had. Jesus said, "They'll know you're my disciples, that you love one another," and we can't even get along to trust each other with a key. So you can imagine how that's viewed in that community. There was another picture that I thought was right here. Let me see. It's an interesting picture. Oh, here it is. Here's the, like going down the main corridor, and you can see off to the left and the right where there's these little cut into the tomb places that are there. Here's one of the smaller little cut in places that they would bury, like the ossuaries, the box of bones that they would have. And then this is another one that I took. They had one of those out there in the open, and I told Melody, I said, "I just want to see what it looks like with somebody in there, how big it is." So I got in there, and they all thought that was funny, and they were afraid I was going to get us arrested in Israel, but we didn't. It was all fine. They worried for nothing. But anyway, that gives you kind of the idea of what the burial places would have looked like. Well, Jesus has been buried. You remember that Joseph of Arimathea, Mark tells us, and then John tells us that Nicodemus was involved in that too, how that they went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, and they took him to this new tomb that belonged to Joseph of Arimathea, and they buried him there. And there was, again, those women that were there looking at it. So verses 1 through 13 of chapter 16 is all about the resurrection of Jesus. It says, when the Sabbath was passed, so all of this, all that we've read about took place before Saturday at 6 p.m. So now they've gone through this 24 hours of, they've buried Jesus hurriedly, and then they've gone, and the disciples are in hiding. They're scared that they might be arrested as well. And one of the things that I think I've kind of touched on a couple of times, but I think really needs to be emphasized at this point is that there were a lot of people over the course of time that claimed to be the Messiah. There was a host of others that claimed to be religious leaders or political leaders or whatever it might be, that tried to rally the people to get them to follow them and to lead a coup against the Roman Empire, to lead the Israelites back to a place of prominence, to give them freedom and independence once again. And what happened every single time with all of those groups is that the leader of that group would be arrested and he would be put to death, and that group would basically fizzle out over just a short amount of time. There's one exception to that, And that was the group that followed Jesus of Nazareth. Not only did it not fizzle out after his death, but it grew and it grew and it grew to the point that it overtook the Roman Empire, and long after the Roman Empire has gone away, that kingdom is still standing. So what the only difference in all of those other groups, all of those other leaders, and Jesus is what we see in chapter 16. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might anoint him. Now, we talked about this group of women back in chapter 15 and verse 47. Again, on Saturday night, they had been waiting for 24 hours, and so when 6 p.m. Sunday evening came, now we can go do something. So they went and bought some spices on Saturday night, and then verse 2, and very early on the first day of the week, so as soon as the sun comes up on Sunday morning, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And again, they're going to the tomb because they didn't get to properly finish all of the burial customs that they went through with a person to properly prepare them for all that. So they're going down there in order to take care of his body, which is interesting because how many times did Jesus say, we looked at all those suffering statements, how many times did Jesus say chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10, we're going to Jerusalem, we're going to be delivered into the hands of wicked men, I'm going to be punished, I'm going to be put to death, I'm going to be buried, and on the third day, I'm going to rise again. And for whatever reason, then still that on the third day, on Sunday morning, they go down to the tomb expecting to take care of a dead body. So they still hadn't gotten it. And they were saying to one another, who will roll the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? Now, Matthew chapter 27, verses 62 through 66 talks about how that Pilate had them to seal a stone. It would have probably have been, this is the way they would typically seal a grave, is they would cut a little trough in the stone. They would have a large round stone that, think about like a giant 6 to 8 foot stone wheel that would have been probably 6 inches to a foot thick. They would roll that in place, and that trough, they could open it up and get back in there later on, and vice versa. But to seal it meant that they would have had sealed around it with wax. Let that run melted wax around it, let that harden, and that's the sealing part of it, to show that nothing had broken the seal, no one had gotten in. Pilate put a band of soldiers there to take care of guarding the place. And these ladies, as they're walking up, they're wondering, hey, we didn't think about this, but we're 3 women. Who's going to roll this big giant stone out of the way for us? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. Have you ever thought about or asked yourself the question, why did the stone get rolled away? Did Jesus need the stone moved to come out of the grave? After his resurrection, we're going to see him in John. He's going to walk through walls, walk through doors, suddenly appear. He didn't need somebody to open the door for him so he could get out of the tomb. He could have done that without the tomb ever being touched. So why is it so important that the tomb was opened? They could go inside and see. See, this was for their purpose, that they could go in and look, because part of what you'll hear with people that try to belittle what Jesus has done and those types of things is that, Jesus, he swooned, he didn't really die, or the disciples stole away his body, or, maybe they went to the wrong grave and whatever, but they went to the right grave and they walked inside and there's the burial clothes, but there's no body. See? So suddenly, it's not just, I think that this is what happened. This isn't somebody else that's pretending to be Jesus. That's another theory, is that Jesus had a twin brother, and the twin brother was the one that was running around after the resurrection. We'll open the tomb so we can go in and see and be witnesses of what's going on. They saw the stone had been rolled away. It was very large, which again is why they're asking in verse 3, who's going to roll it away? And entering the tomb, here's the answer to the question. They walked into the tomb. They saw a young man. Now, other gospel accounts talks about that there's an angel that's sitting inside. There's an angel sitting outside on the rock. Mark doesn't tell us all of those details, but he tells it from their perspective. They walk in and they see what they think is a young man. This is not the only time, by the way, in Scripture that an angel is presumed to be a human being. That's what they look like. And so they see this young man. He's sitting on the right side. Notice all these details, specific details. This is not a made-up story. Sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. By the way, if you were going to make up a story about the Messiah, this is not the story you would make up. You wouldn't make up a story that he was defeated and never established a kingdom where he's sitting on a throne and kicked out the Romans. You never would have dreamed up a story in which someone rose from the grave never to die again. I mean, that's so far outside of our imagination. We have movies and stuff where that happens now, but guess where they're stealing those good ideas from? It's from the Bible. Who would have ever dreamed up that this is the way the Messiah was going to go? When they see this young man dressed in a white robe, it says that they were alarmed. Well, there's a lot of reasons for them to be alarmed at this point. The fact that Jesus' body is not there, the tomb is open, the guards have run off, and then there's this guy sitting in there in the tomb. And so in verse 6, he, that's the young man, as they presume him to be, he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him." So first of all, he tells them, don't be alarmed. And this word that's translated both in verses 5 and 6, as we've talked about, there's a number of these alarmed kind of words. But this one is a word that is a combination of amazement and fear. Like you're really just awestruck at what you've seen, but at the same time, you're scared to death at what you've seen. I kind of think about it like sometimes Garrett and I were out doing some visiting today, and we were driving around in some places where the tornadoes in December had hit and places Garrett hadn't seen. And he said, it's just so weird how, like right here, this house is leveled and all the trees are stripped, and then the next house over, it looks like nothing ever happened. And I said, that's why I like watching those tornado chaser shows on the Weather Channel, because I'm so amazed at tornadoes, but I'm scared to death of them at the same time. Well, that's kind of the idea of what's behind this. They're amazed, they can't take their eyes away, but they're scared to death at the same time. He says, you're seeking Jesus of Nazareth. You're in the right place. He was crucified, but now he's risen. Again, isn't that what Jesus said in all those suffering statements? I'm going to be put to death, I'm going to be buried, and then I'm going to rise again. But they didn't go there anticipating that happening. He's not here. He's been resurrected. And I think it's interesting to note, if you really get what you just saw, here ought to be your response. When you see the place where they laid him, you ought to be wanting to go and tell others about what you've just seen. Wouldn't you? If you went to the cemetery and there was a mausoleum where you had seen a funeral take place a couple of days before, and you walked down there and that mausoleum is open and somebody says, he's gone. He just got up and walked out. You'd go tell somebody, wouldn't you? It may be the police. It may be the National Guard. It may be the news. I don't know who. But you'd go tell somebody. And so he tells them, here's who you need to tell. You need to tell the disciples and Peter. It's interesting because he singles out Peter here. And Peter's one of the disciples. It's like me saying, we have 7 elders. Let's invite the elders over for supper. So call the elders and Glenn. Well, why am I singling out Glenn? He's one of the elders. If I'm calling out the elders, that would include it. If we're telling all the disciples, that would include Peter. But remember the contrast that we saw earlier with Peter, who wanted to follow, the spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak. And Jesus, who didn't want to follow, but did. And how that Peter was the one that said, I will never. All the disciples did, but we've got recorded for us how that Peter denied him 3 times. And how he felt afterwards. In fact, in John's gospel, he's going to talk about how that after all of this happens, Peter says, I'm going fishing. It's almost like Peter saying, well, I'm not very good at this disciple thing. I'm not very good at this apostle thing. But I'll tell you what I can do. I can fish. I've always been a fisherman. My daddy was a fisherman. My brother's a fisherman. I'm a fisherman. I can fish. So he goes out and fishes and catches nothing. I need Peter to know that I'm okay. And not only am I okay, but we're okay, Peter. So you go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee. There we see him just as he told you back in chapter 14 and verse 28. He said, I'm going to go before you to Galilee. And now that's actually happening. But again, even though Jesus told them, they're totally shocked by all this. And so here's what they did. They should have, when they saw, they should have gone and told people. But instead they went out and fled from the tomb for trembling. And this word means to tremble with fear. You're just shaking. You're so scared. And astonishment. And this word is a word that means your mind is carried away. You just can't wrap your mind around what you just saw. Had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. What are they afraid of? Well, they've been afraid of the Romans. They're probably now a little bit afraid at just what they've seen, this unsettling moment of the fact that the tomb has been opened and Jesus is not there, and this young man who was in white raiment is telling them all of these things. Maybe they're afraid because they're not sure where Jesus is and what he's going to say to them when he talks to them, because we did run off. But they were afraid, and that fear crippled them and kept them from doing what they should. Now, we need to talk a little bit about, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just a little bit. Some of your translations may have some brackets around verses 9 through 20 that tells you that oldest ancient manuscripts leave out verses 9 through 20. And we've talked about some different places in the text that, in the Gospel of Mark, that is probably, not supposed to have been there. Maybe there were notes added by a scribe or whatever. And how we can tell that is by going and looking at the oldest manuscripts. The one, you remember you played the telephone game when you were a kid, and I whisper something in Daddy's ear, and he whispers it in Mama's ear, and she whispers it in Justin's ear, and by the time we get all the way back around the room, it's something totally different. So that original source, if we can find those oldest documents that date back closest, then we know. But sometimes even those are a little mixed. And in all of the texts that we look at like this, probably these verses 9 through 20 are the most debated and uncertain about whether they really belong or not. There's 4 main manuscripts that are the oldest that we usually look at with this, and 2 of them have it, and 2 of them don't. So, again, it's a little bit questionable whether or not that is the case. One of the things that I think maybe would help us is to think about it. If 9 through 20 doesn't belong here, all the other things we've talked about, if it's left out, we've pointed out, it really didn't matter. It didn't change the way it's viewed. But if 9 through 20 is not here, think about what this means for the way that Mark would have ended his gospel. That Jesus is resurrected, and some women have found out that the tomb is empty, and they're so scared they don't want to tell anybody about it. The end. Does that sound like the way that... Now, there are some scholars that make a pretty good case of, yes, that is the way he would end it, because his point has been made. The point that Mark was trying to make was that Jesus is the Messiah, and he's shown that no matter what we do with it, the fact is the same. But it seems to me like it would be better served for it to be there. And so there's a variety of theories. One is that Mark, for whatever reason, got to this point and couldn't finish the rest, maybe because of health issues, or maybe he was put to death or whatever. Maybe Peter or Paul or some other inspired writer finished it for him. The reason why that it's in question, in part, is not just the manuscriptal evidence, but if you look at the Greek, there's words used in these last verses that are not used throughout the rest of the gospel. It doesn't, if you're reading, you read a letter from your child written in English, and it doesn't sound like a letter that would have been written by Shakespeare. It's different grammar, different construction, and it doesn't feel like the same writing from Mark earlier. But it seems like, at least to me, that maybe it was, maybe Mark stopped here for whatever reason and then came back and finished it. I don't think there's any reason, though, because the manuscriptal evidence is pretty evenly split. In fact, one of the ones that doesn't have 9 through 20, at the end of that papyrus has a large blank section. And they never left blank sections because they couldn't run down to Office Depot and get another box of paper. They had to really use what they... So that's led some to believe that maybe they're debating does this belong in it or not, whatever. But it seems to me that they're most likely that it was Mark finished at verse 8 and then came back later and wrote 9 through 20. And maybe that's why there's some discrepancy. I will tell you, if you go to wetrainpreachers.com, at the top of that page, there's one of the sections of that website is study resources, and we've talked about this before, that you can get keywords for books and different things. But if you scroll down to the Mark section, there is it's actually one of the lectures, the manuscript on the lectures when at the Bear Valley Lectures a few years ago, we did the Gospel of Mark that Denny Petrillo and Dan Owen combined working on, that talks about the genuineness of this section. And in great detail, they go through all of the different opinions and the evidences and resources. And what they ultimately come to is the idea that this is probably Mark wrote this. It probably happened later on he wrote the first 16 and a half or 15 and a half chapters and then wrote this a little bit later on. But there's no doubt that it's an inspired writing because there's too many of the ancient Christian writings that quote from this particular section. So if you want more information on that, you can look at that. But here's what I will tell you is that this is hotly debated, and that's why you need to know this. But there's nothing in these verses that we have to have from these verses to know what God wants us to do. Okay? So if you're studying with somebody sometime and you're trying to get them to see the importance of baptism, and you're looking at Mark chapter 16, verses 15 through 16, and they say, why, that's debated, that Mark probably didn't even write that. Then you can say, okay, let's turn to Acts chapter 2, or 1 Peter chapter 3, or Acts chapter 22, or Matthew chapter 28. You see what I'm saying? There's so many other places that you can go to teach what's in this section that don't let that be the hill you end up dying on if you're trying to teach somebody how to become a child of God. You with me? But you can go there and find some more information if you'd like. But because I believe it's inspired text, we're going to go ahead and go through what it says. Verse 9, it says, "Now, when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene." That reminds us of John chapter 20. And again, I'm pointing out some of these cross references just to show this isn't something that's made up, that's weird, that we don't see anyplace else. John chapter 20, verses 11 and following. "From whom," Mary Magdalene, "from whom he cast out 7 demons. She went and told." Now in verse 8, she wouldn't tell anybody because she was so scared. But obviously she's had time to process it and think about it, and she's at the point, I need to go. There was this first reaction of fear that crippled her, but eventually she got over that enough that she went and told those who had been with him, and as they mourned and wept. So on Sunday morning, the disciples and Peter's, who she's supposed to go tell, on Sunday morning, on the third day, The women go to the tomb to take care of a dead body, and the disciples are hiding out somewhere, mourning and weeping. What should they have been doing? If you really loved Danny Walker, and you knew he'd been on a long trip, and he was going to fly into Paducah Airport tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and you had missed him so much, what would you be doing? Where would you be tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock?
Waiting for him to arrive to greet him with open arms.
Yeah. Maybe find out what his favorite candy bar and favorite drink is, and have big signs that says, "Welcome home, we love you, we missed you." You would think they'd be lined up outside the tomb with signs saying, "Welcome back, Jesus." That would have been way preceded "Welcome back, Cotter," wouldn't it? It would have been "Welcome back, Jesus. We're glad you came back." He had told them over and over again, "On the third day, I'm going to rise again." But they hadn't got it. So they're mourning and weeping. But when they heard he was alive and had been seen by her, "Oh, we got it wrong. He's alive. Well, let's go down to the tomb and find him." Is that what it says they did? Nope. They would not believe it. Now, we sometimes talk about doubting Thomas. And I think doubting Thomas gets a bad rap. First of all, because he was not the only one that doubted, which is what this verse is showing us. But second of all, doubting Thomas didn't doubt Jesus like we usually say. Doubting Thomas doubted men's reports, and we probably ought to be a little bit skeptical of that. But when somebody that has a good reputation, that's a credible source, is telling us something, is it that we just don't want to believe what somebody else says? We want to hold on to what I think? Have you ever been there before? That Eddie's up here teaching class, and I know what this verse means, and then Eddie says, "Well, here's really the application of that." Do I say, I'm thankful that Eddie helped me to see that? Or do I dig my feet in the mud and say, "Well, I'm not going to budge on this one. You're just wrong"? That's what they're doing here, these doubting disciples. After these things, he appeared in another form to two of them as they were walking into the country, which we see in Luke chapter 24 and verse 16. That another form is physically. He didn't look like himself. And if you read from Luke 24, and eventually on Sunday mornings we'll get there, they didn't recognize him as Jesus. But once they figured out who it was, verse 13, they went back and told the rest. And they said, "Well, now we've got it from the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, so it must be true," right? They still did not believe. They didn't believe them. It's the same result. So then, pardon?
Don't you think, given everything they saw him go through, nearly dead, beaten, nearly to death, hanging on that cross, bleeding like he was, they're human, just like we are. And we have the whole picture in our Bibles, and sometimes we don't believe it.
Yep.
So I really don't, for me, that's not hard to imagine that they didn't believe it.
Yeah, it's not hard to imagine.
They spent all that time with him, and they loved him.
Yep.
And they saw the things that they saw.
Yep. But think about what else they saw. They saw him give sight to the blind
I know, but
and raise the dead.
they're still human.
Oh, I get that. But I'm not being hard on them. Jesus is fixing to get on to them for, it. After all he would say, after all you've seen, after you've been on top of the mountain and heard the voice from the clouds that says, "This is my," after all the times that Jesus said, "I'm going to die, be buried, and raised on the third day," how could you not believe?
I'd like to think that I would believe it, but I don't know.
Oh, no, I'm certain that I wouldn't. Yeah.
The passion when I watched that. I mean, I couldn't hardly bear to watch the parts of it. So I can't imagine the weeping and the hiding and the fear that overcame those human beings.
Yep, I agree. But it still doesn't.
I'm not saying it excuses it. I'm just
Yeah.
saying they're human.
Yep. Yeah, and we talked about a lot how that, there's 28 miracles in the Gospel of Mark. 20 of them are pre-chapter 8, so it's heavy loaded on miracles at the first, proving that he was the Messiah. This is still, even with that, you put it on the scales and it dips to the latter half, because this is the miracle of all miracles. And even after this miracle, they're still not going to get it until the Holy Spirit comes upon them. I think it's funny to a certain degree when you get to Acts chapter 1, after they've spent 40 days with the resurrected Jesus, and he's about to ascend into heaven, one of them says, all right, so now's when you're going to establish your kingdom on the earth, right? And Jesus is like, no, that's not what's happening here. And they just didn't understand it until we sometimes will say, hear people say, if I could see a miracle, if I could see this, then I would believe. But I don't know, because they didn't. And
as much as they sing, we talked about Sunday morning in class. As much as they sing, as many times as they've been told, hey, I'm fixing to be sacrificed. I won't be with you, but can't you get this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's, it's one of those, when you think about just how much it had been ingrained into them what the Messiah was going to be. She's right in that it's so traumatic for them because they loved him and because they had but it's even beyond that, in that they had all, for centuries, this is what Messiah was going to be. And it's a poor illustration. Jackson told me earlier that this is the 45th anniversary of something about Star Wars or something. If you've watched the prequel trio of movies, whenever Obi-Wan and Anakin has that big fight, and Anakin's down in the ditch and Obi-Wan's up top, and he's just so upset. You were the chosen one, he cries out. He was supposed to be. They had in their mind what this was going to be, and you're not. Well, there's so much of that that's built into this. But I want you to notice, though, as we get into these last 4 verses, I want you to notice that Jesus does get onto them for that. But I think there is a massive lesson about grace and hope that is found even after that I think we really need to get. So afterward, he appeared to the 11 themselves. Now we're not going through witnesses. Now Jesus is going to appear to the 11 themselves. Notice we've talked about all through Mark the 12, but now, of course, Judas is out of the picture and it's just the 11. They were reclining at table, and he rebuked them. But notice what he rebuked them for. 2 things. Number 1, their unbelief. And then number 2, which seems to be a separate thing, is the hardness of heart. The unbelief we can kind of understand, but the hardness of heart, that you're not willing to be taught, that's the problem. And we've noted time and again in this gospel about the importance of the heart and the hardness of heart. Chapter 3 and verse 5, chapter 6 and verse 52, chapter 8, 17, chapter 10 and verse 5, chapter 16 and verse 14. The solution was found in chapter 12, verses 32 through 33, to love the Lord your God with all your heart. Just completely give it to Him. Put aside what I want Him to be or what I think He is, and just what is He, and follow that. For their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they did not believe those who saw Him after He had risen, and these were trustworthy sources, and they were confirming what Jesus had told them all along. And He said to them, go, and the word here means as you're going, into all the world and wait a minute. These are the people that don't get it. These are the people that have unbelief and hardness of heart. Here's where it really hits me, Charlotte. If it was me, I would tell these 11, just go back to fishing. I'll find some better guys. But even after all of that, Jesus says, I've got a job for you to do. Go into all the world, proclaim the good news, and we've been talking about the good news they've been proclaiming all along is the reign and rule of God. But now there's another twist to it, because now we have the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus added to that, to the whole creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned. So there's the message there's this good news. If you believe it and you're baptized, you're going to be saved. If you don't believe, you're going to be condemned. And a lot of people want to make a big deal about, well, he didn't say about baptism on the second. Well, it's not going to happen. If you don't believe, you're not going to be baptized. And so his message is, if you want to be saved, you got to believe and you got to be baptized. That's the message you're going to give. And then he talks about these signs. And the signs, really the meaning behind what's going on, will be accompanying those who believe in my name. They will cast out demons. They'll speak in new tongues. They'll pick up serpents with their hands. And if they drink any deadly poison, it will not hurt them. They will lay on their hands on the sick and they will recover. Now, what's the purpose of this? Some people will still try today to say this is what we need to be doing. There's people that have handled snakes in worship services and gotten bitten and ultimately died or drank poison or whatever and died. Is the purpose of what he's saying for all time? Well, notice if you go on down to his ascension, it says, so then the Lord Jesus, after he'd spoken to them, was taken up into heaven, sat down on the right hand of God, and they went out and preached, which is what he told them to do in verse 15. They went out and preached everywhere while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by accompanying signs. What signs? The signs he talked about in verse 17. And those signs are what confirmed the message that they were teaching. Is there any purpose in having that confirming the message anymore? Well, of course not, because we can look into God's Word and confirm it. But I do think it's so interesting that if you count how many times that belief or unbelief is used in chapter 16, how many of them did not believe, they did not believe, they did not believe, they did not believe, and then Jesus gets on to them because they did not believe. But then he says, I got a job for you. You know, there are times that we stumble in our belief. Our belief is shaken for whatever reasons, that we, because we're human, you know, we sometimes pick the wrong path, choose the wrong thing, don't have enough faith. But the hope of the gospel is that God's not counting on us to be perfect in order for him to get the job done. He's just counting on us to be usable. And if we believe in him enough that we keep coming back to him and turning back to him, then he can use us to do great and mighty things. In fact, throughout the Bible, God has a history of using the people that are a mess to do the most work for him. So whatever mess of a situation that you're in, the same Jesus that can defeat the greatest enemy of death, that can take away our greatest problem of sin, and can give us the greatest hope of eternity with him, can take you and whatever mess you have and use it for his glory, if we've got the kind of heart that we turn to him. Hopefully, the Gospel of Mark teaches us that we allow him to be king of our lives, that we allow him to rule in our lives, that we deny self, take up our cross, and follow him, make him king, let him use us in whatever capacity he wants us to, and just see how greater things can be accomplished in the kingdom. That's really the message of the Gospel of Mark. And I do think that our hearts break for the disciples because we can see ourselves in them so much, which I think is a blessing to us. I think my papa used to say if it wasn't for Peter, he said, I'd give up on Christianity a long time ago, because Peter just kept messing up. But God kept using him, and he can us as well. Well, that concludes our study of the Gospel of Mark, and I hope, again, that it encourages you to let God rule in your life in whatever capacity that you can and build your faith in Jesus as God the Son. I want to give us a couple of announcements.